Hey everybody, so I'm back today with my first episode of Inquisitorial Thoughts, episode 1. I want to talk today about cartoon versus realistic painting techniques and styles. I think it's one way to, there are a lot of ways to break down how you want to do different effects, and one of them is just, do you go more with a cartoon style with your highlighting, or do you go with more of we call a realistic style? Both of them, I think, can be challenging, and one is really not better at all than the other. But I think they can bring different things out in the model. I'd thought about this quite a bit in the past, and I've talked about it before, but I've had some more unique realizations around some of this that recently that I wanted to share with you guys. These are my personal opinions, but I think it kind of centers around why there's certain models that I haven't liked as much in the past, and then when seeing them painted a little bit differently, all of a sudden I kind of liked the model quite a bit more. It changed my perspective. Oftentimes I can look at a sculpt and I can say, oh, I really like that sculpt, or I don't like it. And it's not been typical for me that, like, I can, in the same way, like how something's painted or not. But it's not been too typical that the painting has just directly influenced me to say I like that sculpt now, just because of the way they painted it, until recently. And that is, like, as an example, this here, this plague bearer, I typically, even though I like Nurgle and I'm planning on doing a lot of Nurgle, it's unfortunate, but I've never really in the past been a big fan of this model. When doing the demo of the demon, greater demon that I'm going to be painting, the one by Ultraforge, I'd said something to the effect of, this guy looks really sinister, he passes the goofy test to me, and so I really like it. I like this, it's not goofy, and I think, I don't think goofy and cartoony are exactly the same thing, but they kind of can border and be similar for me, and so this plague bearer here, I think his sculpt itself is a bit more cartoony. Like, if you took the paint off and if you envision this as just gray plastic, the kind of features that he has looks less realistic to me and a bit more cartoonish. That in of itself isn't necessarily a bad thing. I sometimes, when seeing things that are much more pure fantasy, so if I see a space marine, I see a human face, maybe proportion features, and it looks realistic, and I'm like, okay, so that doesn't look cartoony to me per se. But when I see something like this, right off the bat, it's like pure fantasy. Okay, do I believe it? Like, do I believe when I see a story, like, is this what I see in the story, or is this something that is just a hard thing to convince me that it even belongs on the table? Now, I'm sorry if I'm rambling here, because it's sort of a little bit hard for me to express completely what I mean about this. So recently, I saw a video where somebody had some plague bearers, and they painted them very dark, and then their spots they painted lighter, but it was painted in a way that I would have called much more realistic, like shooting for realism. So perhaps more weathering. I think weathering in general, like when you're weathering tanks and when you're weathering stuff, it generally shoots for realism as a technique. And so, in my experience, when you're shooting for a cartoony paint job, you're generally not weathering it to death. Like, you're showing really nice changes in contrast and really nice highlights and things like that, and they can look great, And it's actually sometimes a very hard technique to do. I'm not downing it, but I think that it kind of goes away a little bit from the realism, and so or a realistic look. And so when you have a sculpt that even before the paint hits it, it's actually extremely cartoony, and then when you do a really cartoony paint job on that sculpt, for me, it really accentuates it further. And this is probably just a personal taste thing. I'm not actually saying things should be done any particular way, but for me, that's where I kind of personally I struggle more, because it's like, oh, I have my my Space Marines on the table, and they're kind of realistic looking, and then I have this like pink thing that's bright red and pink, and it kind of has this face that is sort of really cartoonish looking, and I just have trouble seeing them together, you know, and enjoying that look together on the table. And so this is more, I think, wondering what you guys think. I think it's a technique, perhaps, and as a learning painter, as someone that's always learning and always has something to learn, what I think I've learned from this is that, and I wish I don't have an example in front of me to show this painted in a realistic fashion, so those of you, I'll show some examples of my own painting where I've done what I consider to be more cartoony and where I consider to be more realistic. But if you have, I think there is a technique, perhaps, where if you have a sculpt that you would consider to be shooting for more realism in the sculpt itself, by applying a cartoony paint job to that, you can make it pop, and you can have that muralism, like that sort of realistic sculpt, blend very nicely with that cartoony effect. You could also take it a step further and even make it more realistic. Then perhaps when you have more of a cartoony sculpt, you can use the technique of trying to paint some more realism to it to make it look more, blend in with a realistic setting, if that's what you're shooting for, like on the table. Or perhaps you like ultra cartoony and you want it to be over the top and really pop like that. Just flipping the page, I think these guys, well, I think these guys even more. Hang on. Pink Horror, this is what I'm shooting for. These guys, you know, like, you can take something that's really what I would consider more on the cartoony side, and then take it a step even further and make it really bright, and, you know, not have a lot of weathering or shading, and you know, just have nice blends of highlights that make it really pop, and perhaps just lots of contrast but not actual shading, you know, so contrast within certain defining crevices but not lots of shading showing the gradations of that, you know, layer, if that makes sense. And so I thought, I guess the takeaway for me is I thought that it was a very interesting concept, that maybe the fact that I didn't like those sculpts in the past, and now I kind of almost did when I saw them painted a different way, was this choice of a more cartoon style on a certain type of sculpt, be it cartoon or realistic, versus a realistic style of painting on a certain kind of sculpt, being cartoon or realistic. That sounds very confusing when I listen to hear me, you know, saying that, but I hope you understand what I mean. How your painting can really, really change the way you view the sculpt in its setting. So, hope I'm not being Mr. Obvious on that, because for me, it was sort of a little bit of a refreshing thought, you know, in understanding why I like certain things. Now, I think if I took these two, I typically paint more what I would consider, I shoot more in my painting, particularly recently because I've been doing more historicals, what I would consider to be shooting more for realism. And so, despite that these are all fantasy type models, you know, I'm not sure if my lighting here shows it real well, but I used a lot of weathering like on this guy, and you know, there's lots of chips and there's crud, and you know, he's not by any means you know, showing like lots of different highlights of orange and just lots of contrast, and that's it. But maybe even more so, this one that you've seen recently, this guy is heavily weathered, and I didn't at all go for a cartoony look. Like I tried to go for a realistic, gritty, you know, kind of type look on him. In the past, and these are ones that I did, some of them quite a while ago and some just a little while ago. I have this Eldar here, where this was kind of early in my painting career, and I think I did, without realizing, kind of shoot more for a cartoony look. I shot more for contrast and lots of different kinds of colors, and I didn't shoot as much for a realistic look. And so for me, within my own painting, this would be an example of what I would consider to be. I often bring this guy out because he was early in my career, but he was sort of a mini that I really liked that I did early, where I kind of said, wow, like I'm starting to enjoy this painting stuff. And so another one would be this sort of Eldar on the bike. So I've got him here, and I shot more, I think, for more of a contrast and a cartoony look. I didn't want really dirty armor. You know, I did, despite saying that in there, I did use some oils and grease a little bit inside the engine compartments there. But I think for most of the part, I achieved more of a cartoony look. I'll be quite honest, I probably lean more towards the realism lately. I enjoy it with some of the models that I'm doing, but then also more recently, but then also I find the cartoony stuff to be a little bit harder, and I try to push myself a bit more in my highlighting, in my edge highlighting, to try to achieve some of that, and I think that's an area for improvement for me. It's an area where certainly as I get miniatures where I want to do that more, it'll allow me to grow as a painter. But yeah, I think that's the main message today. You know, cartoony for me, and thought for discussion, is cartoon sort of style painting for certain kind of sculpts, or realistic, and can it really affect the way you believe in certain fantasy sculpts, and whether they're let's say you buy it, like you buy the way it looks, you buy it in your setting, versus it's too over the top for you, you know. I don't know. And so interested in hearing everybody else's thoughts. Take care.